Welcome into the Blurred Wire. Today, we are continuing our theme of following the Mad Max films that came out in the 80s while Furiosa is in theaters. And unfortunately, it's still kind of struggling in theaters. But we're going to talk about some of the films that inspired it. Well, some of the films that are in that same franchise, in that same universe with Mad Max Road Warrior. But first, how are you doing today? How are you doing today, Ty? What's going on? How's life?
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying me some post-apocalyptic Australia over here.
The post-apocalyptic Australia. Yeah. So like you said, to me, like some of the most interesting things about covering these movies back in the 80s right now is looking at how is Furiosa doing at the box office, just following it, like with this whole, because the entire feels like this entire year has been a slump. Like Dune Part 2 was a huge hit and a success, but most movies, like I think this is one of the first years where most movies have bombed compared to becoming hits. Like some movies have barely made back their budgets, and for the most part, I mean, Madam Web bombed, The Fall Guy bombed, Furiosa's at 144 million and its budget is 168. And it's like every passing day, every passing weekend, it's like I don't think it's going to end up, even getting to 300 million. And his break even point is closer to 400 million. So looking back at all these, like what's going on in the film industry, I feel like is really interesting, especially when you look back at some of the movies that helped start this franchise. Um,
Mhm.
so let's go ahead and break down Mad Max 2 Road Warrior. Now, for many people, this is kind of became the best film, one of the best action films of all time, is what a lot of
Mhm.
people describe it as, a lot of critics described it as. It had widespread acclaim, and I see why. So what did you think about Mad Max 2? Like what stands out to you? What did you like about it? Maybe didn't like about it?
It's great, man. It's of its time stylistically, but there
Mm-hmm.
are things that feel so forward thinking that like even today we don't see the same kind of like dedication to the like the commitment to the bit
Mm-hmm.
that George Miller is doing here. This feels like such a refinement from Mad Max 1. He saw how, how impressive he was able to make the vehicular action in that movie on such a shoestring budget, and now with a much larger budget, able to able to go all out
Oh
and
yeah.
make the large scale action movie that he was wanting to do before, and he did it with an extra dose of weirdness, which I love. um
Mm-hmm.
and this movie is just so good and so entertaining to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this movie is where, like, I remember watching the first one and I was like, because again, I had just seen Fury Road and I was like, what? Because, like, the two movies, like, if they were titled different things, like, if you titled one Fury Road and you just titled Mad Max, like, I wouldn't have thought those movies were related at all. The only reason why I knew they were related was because they both started with Mad Max. But after watching Road Warrior, that's when I started to see, oh, this is how it all happens. Like after watching this movie, I see how this connects to Mad Max Fury Road. I kind of see how um and again, it came out way before Fury Road did, but this is kind of how like it is interesting to see how the universe is not the wasteland, the apocalyptic era that we're in is continually deteriorating, which we don't
Mhm.
always see. Like in a lot of movies, they'll show like even in an apocalyptic trilogy, they'll show like, okay, the world got to this point and everything sucks right here. And this is the era that we're talking in, and everything is just kind of like the same level of suckage for lack of a better word. Like it's like you
Mhm.
don't see a gradual getting worse. But
Yeah.
in this era, we actually do see it because we see the way people are getting more and more unhinged, crazy things.
Mhm.
Like there are less and less rules. Like Mad Max still felt like some semblance of society and
Mhm.
still had some rules on it. And
Yeah.
then Mad Max 2 just let go of some of them, and then when we get
Yeah.
to three, and then by Fury Road, they're all gone, and it's
Yeah.
absolutely so you can really see how it builds. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier while we were talking, but I think out of all of the Mel Gibson Mad Max movies, to me, this is his strongest performance. Like a lot of critics praise the action, the score, the cinematography, the sparing use of dialogue, but they also praise his performance. To me, his performance is what makes this my favorite in the 80s trilogy.
Really?
Um, mhm. And it makes it, and to me, that's what pushes it towards one of the best films of all time. Because again, for Mad Max Fury Road, it was Charlize Theron's performance that pushed it towards, because you got to have that powerful acting performance that pushes a movie when you start talking about one of the best action movies of all time. Fury
Hmm.
Road, it was Charlize Theron. For this one, to me, it was Mel Gibson. He seemed a lot more driven, a lot more passionate, a lot more determined in this role. And I really bought into what he was trying to do. Um, Even if I didn't fully understand what was all going on around him, because again, the world
Hmm.
has gotten into this crazy, crazy place. But you could tell that like he was not going to stop. And like I feel like Charlize Theron, I feel like their performances are closer. Even though Tom Hardy was playing the same character in Mad Max, he seemed a lot more passive and like this is something that we could do because it would make sense.
Hmm.
Um, but in both of those movies, Charlize Theron and Mel Gibson, they had that drive that I think is what pushed this movie towards the top and got it, recognized for the acclaim that it rightfully deserves.
Yeah, I think he's definitely more interesting, even if he has maybe about the same, probably a little bit less to say, all things said and done, than in the first movie. Like
Hmm.
physically speaking, he does not talk much, which is my preferred like Mad Max in this series.
Hmm.
I do not want him to talk as much. I don't want anyone to talk as much. I just want to see I want the action to speak for itself.
Yeah. And
And I think
I
this movie sets that tone really, 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 really well.
hmm And I think like, you compare it to other action movies, compare it to other, car action movies specifically, and obviously the biggest franchise that comes to mind is the Fast and Furious franchise. And all those movies have pretty much been blasted by critics, and rightfully so. I mean, some of them have been like, they're like, okay, this was good, but like obviously a lot of them don't get the same critical acclaim, and for good reason. And like when you watch the action scenes in those movies compared to this one, I realize like a huge difference a lot of times is dialogue. Like stuff is still happening, but it feels like in like the Fast and Furious movies, they have to be describing what's going on to the audience at
Hmm.
the same time. Like they'll always do fast camera cuts and you'll see Ludacris going, go, go, go. Or Tyrese Gibson is like, ah, nah, man, not mine. Like they're always talking throughout every single action scene. Like it's full of dialogue. It never
Hmm.
just lets the action just speak for itself, because you
Yeah.
can't do that with this franchise because the action is not um dynamic enough to speak for itself. You got to have the dialogue in there to like keep people engaged and make it seem witty, and that's why it's like they don't shut up throughout the entire movie. They're always constantly talking.
Yeah.
And for George Miller's style, like to me, like that just it makes it so much more unique and powerful, and the action scenes actually hit when you just remove all that dialogue, even compared to
Yeah.
superhero action movies. Whenever there's an action scene going on, there's always talking during it, and like you don't
Hmm.
really think of that as being a it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you need it in a scene, like if something's happening and they gotta get something or describe or talk to each other. But it's so amazing when directors are able to do it without using that dialogue, because then it really makes it stand out. My brother always uses the point of like, when you have a story in a movie, I want you to show me, not tell me. You don't need to
Hmm.
tell me what's happening. You need to show it to me so that way I can see it. And I feel like that's the difference between this action movie and most others, because George Miller is able to show it to you through sound effects, through cinematography, but he doesn't have to use words to tell you what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting when you take that and you compare it to kind of like big action films that came out around the same time. So think from the other 80s action hits like Die Hard, like Escape from New
Mhm.
York, like Predator, like even Indiana Jones. Those came
Oh
out in
yeah,
the
yeah.
80s.
Hmm.
Um, those movies had either like witty like lead characters or lots of like dialogue and communication like a lot of like
Charismatic characters,
very
yeah.
charismatic, thank you,
Hmm.
yeah, very charismatic like action heroes. Max is not
Nope.
charismatic in this movie. Dude just seems like a little PO'd all the time, and like he just wants to get his gasoline. Or
Yes.
excuse me, gasoline. He just wants to get some gasoline. Like that's all he wants. And in that
Hmm.
way, it doesn't feel like it feels not as influential, but it is so much more interesting than to me going back and watching it like 30, 40 years later, after the fact, to go back and watch this movie and see how, alternate timeline where that was the influential like main action hero, very silent, very just focused on the visuals. And I think it holds up to me better as a film because of it,
Hmm.
because it's so much more unique. It feels a little bit less of the time because of it. There's definitely some trappings that make it feel like an 80s movie, but because it's so distinct from everything else, I can understand the hype around it more as to why it became such a beloved and praised action movies, where a lot of other films in the genre zigged. This one is zagging and becoming the monolith that it is.
Agreed. And I think, in you think for like even if you look back to the 80s, more action, even if you branch over into sci-fi and space opera. I mean, look at Star Wars, look at Han Solo. Like, would Star Wars have become that trilogy? Do you think it would have become as big as it did if they didn't have Harrison Ford doing the charismatic Han Solo? Like, that's part of
Mhm.
what helped launch those franchise. And it feels like some movies and some TV shows can kind of like live or die on the dialogue. Like Madam Web definitely died on its dialogue as well as other things. But like, dialogue can make, obviously it's a huge part of the story because that's how humans talk to each other and connect to each other.
Mhm.
But if you craft a movie that doesn't require dialogue to connect with somebody, that's what separates it and puts it in a whole new category. And that's
Mhm.
what I think, like I said, branches to, because I still got what Mad Max was trying to do and what he needed to accomplish. It's just he didn't have to talk about it much.
Yeah.
And I don't think I realized how much, like, it wasn't until I saw Furiosa that I realized how much characters don't really talk in these movies,
Mhm.
because like, again, all of them have such high octane action throughout the entire movie. You don't
Mhm.
even really notice that much, that there's not much conversation happening. But because Furiosa is slightly leaning more towards character study than it is like nonstop action, the
Right.
silence kind of hits a little bit differently. And it's kind
Yeah.
of like, oh wow, there's actually not a lot of dialogue on this. Like, I think I've said more about this movie than Anya Taylor-Joy said in the entire movie.
Yeah.
Like, I think and you start to realize that because there's just not a lot of conversation in it. And again, it's not the same, nonstop action as these other movies do. And so I think it was a genius decision on George Miller, and it's one of those things that's like he's the only one who I think has really done it to success. And as far as like limited dialogue kind of action style, And I don't think, because I can't think of another movie that has done it or done it so well that it gets the acclaim as these two movies, you know?
I think going back, I'm really enjoying this project of being able to go back and watching the original Mad Max films
Hmm.
now after having seen Fury Road and Furiosa, because to me, I feel like George Miller, his style, I wish was more influential to big blockbuster action movies. Like
Hmm.
I feel like they went more the way of an Indiana Jones or a Star Wars
Exactly.
with a very charismatic a Harrison Ford type. And while that's fun, I also wish there was more of an influence on these silent, almost silent, just like action driven blockbusters that makes me appreciate what he's doing all the more because George Miller isn't necessarily the most variety director in everything he does, but he has a vision and he keeps trying to perfect that vision. And I
Hmm.
feel like every movie that I see of his, I can see in one way or another, he's refining a different aspect of what he wants to make. And I can see through this original Mel Gibson trilogy the kind of the Frankenstein pieces that he then takes away to create the monster that is Fury Road after the fact, like the climactic action sequence of Road Warrior, where we've got the oil rig driving Mel Gibson driving the oil rig and the group of raiders like driving after him and the rigged like fight like that was so great and so unlike anything that came out around the time. And to me it's so cool to see the inspiration for the similarly led action sequences in Fury Road. And it makes me want to go back and rewatch Fury Road again after all of this, just to see where the inspiration started and how he evolved it further. Because just off the top of my head, like he just turned everything up to 11
Hmm.
after it. And it's so great to see the origins of it.
And I think you hit it spot on. First of all, when you said like that he was trying to perfect his vision, like to me, this was him getting there, right?
Hmm.
Right? Because again, I think Mad Max 2 is a fantastic movie, and I think it stretches beyond its genre. Like Mad
Hmm.
Max was like it feels like it belongs in the 80s. It is an 80s movie. But Mad
Right.
Max 2 goes beyond that. Not
Yes.
like it's you can still tell it was made in the 80s, obviously, but it goes beyond that. And to
Hmm.
me, Beyond the Thunderdome, I didn't think it was bad, but I don't like if we're just talking about based upon how good Mad Max 2 was, it felt like a slight step back. But I feel
Hmm.
like Fury Road, that was where he perfected his vision because
Hmm.
that's where he saw what worked, what didn't, and brought all those elements together and made a film that's going to stand the test of time. And I
Hmm.
think 30, 45 years from it, maybe we'll still be talking about Mad Max 2. I hope so. But I definitely think we'll still be talking about Fury Road. And I definitely think people will still be coming over and coming to your house, having a party, and watching Fury Road and talking about it like with some of the movies that are coming out 20, 30 years from now.
And I think in that vein, we could still do the same thing with Road Warrior. Like I
Yeah,
feel confident in the action that I could still like, yeah, let's come over. Let's just kick it and watch Road Warrior because
let's
it's
just
that
check it
good.
out. Yeah, and like I love how you mentioned that like while people talk about Mad Max 2 and Fury Road as some of the greatest action movies ever, and those are from the same franchise, which doesn't really happen that often. People don't quote like they don't quote like Die Hard 1, 2, or 3 and 1, 2, and 2 as the best action. Like they talk about the first one as like one of the top action movies of all time. But nobody is trying to recreate, not even recreate, but like directors don't talk about how Mad Fat Max influenced their style, or like
Hmm.
studios aren't really trying to make another. Mad Max. And I'm not saying like that they should be trying to like recreate it, but again, using the same concept of an action driven rather than dialogue driven storyline, franchises and all that weirdness and like franchises aren't really movie studios aren't really doing that. When you look at movie studios, they all want to create the next Star Wars. They all want to create, I mean, you look at what Zack Snyder did with Rebel Moon. Even look at
Mhm.
Dune. Like again, obviously Star Wars was influenced by Dune and Dune was fantastic, but I
Mhm.
feel like the success of Star Wars is what made Warner Bros be like, okay, yeah, let's greenlight a Dune movie. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
those are the kind of things, like that's what studios want. That's what they want to recreate. They all want to recreate their own MCU, like create a whole shared universe narrative. When the MCU, I don't think it's like no one talks about any of those movies. Like I love them, but people don't talk about them as being one of the greatest action movies of all time. And
Mhm.
so I think it's very interesting that you bring that up because like these are some of the greatest action movies of all time. These are themes that people could take from, and it's like, but they don't. And like Fast and Furious, like I said, is a perfect example of a franchise that's been going on for so long, and that you would think that it was kind of inspired by it, but the only
Mhm.
thing they have in common are cars.
Or Cars.
And
Yeah.
even that's not really that, common. So I think it's very, very interesting. Like I said, that you bring that up, and I think it's true. Like if I was a director, I feel like if I wanted to be like an action director, even if it wasn't like a movie, like it doesn't have to be about cars to like want to keep that same concept of limited dialogue, more action and more showing rather than telling.
Mhm.
And again, I feel like it's a very big film concept. Like if you go to a film school, they will always stress, show your audience, don't tell them. But you go look at big budget movies and they don't do that. They just tell you rather than show you. You know what
Mm,
I
yeah.
mean? It's like it's like how exactly like it feels like the lesson isn't really like studios don't really see that as profitable. They see it's like that's good art, but that's not the $1 billion blockbuster, that we want.
Right. I think another point I want to highlight of his style is again one of my favorite scenes in this movie is George Miller treating vehicles like animals. Towards the beginning when Max is kind of scoping out the town, the little village,
Hmm.
and he's got his binoculars and he's watching as the raiders are kind of doing their raid, they're like encircling like the encampment. It looks like he's watching like a herd of animals, like he's a hunter
Yep.
and he's just trying to stoke them out. The way that like they're like the dust like kind of trails behind them feels like a stampede of animals moving by with a trail of dust behind them. I don't know if it's just me who's just really obsessed with that, or if he like is so intentional with it, but he makes these vehicles feel like living organisms in a dead world, and it's so cool, it's so unique. I wish more movies had that dedication to craft like he obviously has here.
Hmm. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Like I said, and maybe, some directors or some studios are like afraid to do what George Miller has done so well. But like, like I said, even looking at some of the great movies that have come out that are kind of weird in their own way. Like the closest one I can think of right now, besides Furiosa, obviously, is probably Dune Part Two, because obviously it's very, very weird. And it'll be
Mhm.
interesting to see how much weirder the franchise gets. And like I kind of see why Denis Villeneuve was like, I'm gonna make Dune Messiah, and then if someone else wants to take over, go ahead, because it gets a lot
So
weirder.
if someone else wants to direct a dude turning into a worm,
Yeah,
that's on
that's
them.
fine. Yeah,
You
go
can do
ahead.
that.
But like it still worked, but that's also still a very dialogue driven movie. But the
Hmm.
dialogue is very important in that movie for that reason, because it's part of what helps establish the world and the narrative that we're part undertaking. So
Hmm.
again, it's like I don't know, because like I feel like and most studios probably don't want to like hire a big time actor and have them only say like 10 lines, because they're like, I didn't pay you just to say 10 lines. That's not what's going to draw in ticket sales or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
But I think it's interesting. And like I wish Furiosa was doing better at the box office because then
Mhm.
we'd have a much better chance of seeing that kind of storytelling being rehashed.
Mhm.
Um and while Mad Max was like a box office success, while Fury Road was like successful critically,
Mhm.
because Mad Max was successful because of its box office return. It was a
Mhm.
huge return on investment, but it didn't
Mhm.
actually gross like a whole lot. And same
Mhm.
with Fury Road. Like none of these movies have grossed over 500 million. None of them have grossed
Mhm.
over 400 million.
Mhm.
So, like I said, from a studio executive standpoint, they're probably like, yeah, I mean, it's good. It's like critically, but like that's not my $1 billion hit. And so
Mhm.
like I said, I wish it was doing better because then that would mean maybe more filmmakers would want to kind of take that style and use it.
Right.
But unfortunately, it doesn't. I don't, like I said, I think it's going to end up as a bomb, which is really sad.
It's a bummer.
Yeah. But anyway, on a much happier note, make sure you check out Mad Max 2 if you want to see Furiosa or thought about seeing it. And if you liked, like I said, even if you don't really like the Mad Max franchise, I don't know. Furiosa is worth it to go see it. Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There's been some movies I went to this year, and I'm like, that wasn't really worth my money for going in, but Furiosa was. So
Furiosa is worth your money and
yeah,
time.
out of all the movies that we've seen, like again, when I walked out of Godzilla and Kong and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, I wasn't like this was terrible, but I was like, I mean, I could have seen this at home, and I really wouldn't have
Mhm.
changed.
This could have been an
Furiosa,
email.
yeah, this could have been an email. Yes. Furiosa needs to be seen in theaters. And Mad Max 2, I think, is on Prime. So watch it, check it out, and let us know your thoughts. If you liked Mad
Mhm.
Max 2, if you truly think it's one of the greatest action films of all time, or if you don't, if you think that is kind of overrated, whatever your thoughts are, let us know in the
Let us
comments.
know.
And we'll see you next time. Thank you guys for joining.